Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for showing up. We appreciate your time. I hope everyone is safe and recovering from a pretty tough past couple of weeks, but hopefully the next couple are looking a little bit better for everybody. So this is the final event in SHEA's workshop series for the fall semester. So today, you've already heard them talking for a little bit, but our two guests are going to be speaking about the medicalization of race. And it's going to be kind of a conversation between them. But if you guys have any questions, you can of course send them to me in the chat, or you can just put them out there during the conversation if you'd like them to respond to it. So today we're joined by Professor Anthony Hatch, who is a critical sociologist and chair of the Science and Society program at Wesleyan University, as well as an affiliate faculty in the Department of African American Studies, the College of the Environment, and the Department of Sociology. Professor Hatch is an expert in health systems, medical technology, and social inequality. He is the author of Blood Sugar, Racial Pharmacology and Food Justice in Black America, and Silent Cells, The Secret Drugging of Captive America. We're also joined by Professor Joanna Radin, who is a historian of biomedical features and an associate professor of history of medicine, a core member of the program in history of science and medicine, and affiliated with the departments of history, anthropology, American studies, and programs in ethnicity, race and migration, and religion and modernity. She has particular interest in global histories of biology, ecology, medicine, technology, and anthropology since 1945, biomedical technology and computing, and feminist, indigenous, and queer STS. She's the author of Life on Ice, a history of new uses for cold blood, cryopolitics, frozen history in a melting world, as well as two recent articles entitled Ethics in Human Biology, the historical perspective on present challenges, and Why Did They Die? Biomedical narratives of epidemics and mortality among Amazonian indigenous populations in socio-historical and anthropological contexts. So those are some pretty lengthy works, but after this workshop, I'll send an email to everybody with links to more of their books and writings if you're interested, as well as a link to our website where you can find recordings of our past workshops. So without further ado, we have the first question and then they'll take it away. But at first, I just want to know, how did you guys get here? So what brought you to studying race and its interaction with medicine and science?
Yeah.
You want to go first?
Yeah, maybe I'll go first and just jump right in and just welcome. Thanks to everybody who showed up to participate in a conversation with us. And I think, we really would, I'd like to, for everyone to join in with us as you're able in through other conversation. I entered into questions of race and health and justice through public health. I was an undergraduate student at Dartmouth, and in philosophy, I was a philosophy major, and certainly had no intentions of getting a job with that. But nonetheless, at the end of my sophomore year, I had an opportunity to work at Emory School, at the Rollins School of Public Health at Emory University, for a kind of a community-based public health research project focused in Atlanta's public housing projects. This research project just kind of got me really excited about working in a university, producing knowledge, helping people, and health was just kind of the backdrop for that work, which I saw as being about racial uplift and justice and trying to help others. And so it was having a conversation with one of my mentors at that time who, asked me if I was considering going into public health as opposed to something else. And she asked me if I wanted to work on my own project or whether I wanted to work on someone else's projects my whole life. And I kind of said I wanted to work on my own. And so then that pushed me toward, she said, well, you need to, don't get an MPH right now, go get a PhD, and then you can, do health in whatever field you choose. And so, that day, I literally chose sociology sitting there with her. I had, taken some sociology courses at Dartmouth. And so then began, this kind of thinking about race and health inequality in graduate school. First as a demographer and statistician with training in advanced statistics. And then later as a historical comparative and kind of critical race theorist for my dissertation, which became the book Blood Sugar. So there's a lot of detail to fill in there, but it was through public health and a desire to want to improve the conditions of people living, in the margins and trash bins of our society, and really wanting to focus on that.
I have a kind of similar trajectory in that I studied science communication as an undergrad at Cornell, and I was really interested in how do people with kind of technical expertise communicate with people with decision-making power, and that led me to kind of develop an interest in different forms of communication about risk, particularly around issues of health and medicine. And I wound up working as a practitioner for a number of public health organizations, including the CDC Centers for STDs, at the time it was STDs, HIV, and TB. And in that job, I really started to engage with the epidemiological data around these different conditions, and also the media messages, the way that this epidemiological data was translated. And what I learned really kind of astounded me. So this was in the early 2000s, and it amazed me that it was only then that people in these organizations were starting to realize that the way that HIV was being experienced, say, among gay men in San Francisco was not at all the same of how the epidemic was unfolding among, say, Black women in the South, or African American men, or MSM, which was men who have sex with men, which was a new term that emerged at the time. And I really got interested in questions of, who are the, how has difference shaped or shaping of and shaped by the ways that we ask questions in science and medicine epidemiologically. And I wound up going back to grad school. I actually thought I was going to have my own health communications consulting company. And I thought, I'll get a PhD in history of science and medicine. That'll be the way to do that. I don't know, maybe I still will. But I really fell in love with, the opportunity to go deep into these questions and with history as a method. And I started to really hone in on questions about who are the bodies upon which knowledge about biomedicine and more broadly what it means to be human get made. And I started to, it was 2005, which was the year that National Geographic's Genographic project launched, which was a kind of instantiation of a longer set of practices of sampling and archiving human biological variation. This project kind of presaged and laid the groundwork for things like 23andMe, which you may have engaged with. And I got really interested in, like, how is this knowledge being produced? Why am I a kind of a Jewish woman who grew up on Long Island being asked to know myself through the bodies of indigenous peoples around the world? What kind of kinship is that? And that's what led me, I didn't ever plan to write about freezers. I wanted to write about the research on human biological variation and human difference. But when I started to scratch at that question, as I write in my book, it drew blood, specifically blood that had been collected from indigenous peoples around the world and frozen after the Second World War. The idea being that indigenous peoples were gonna supposedly go extinct through forces of intermixing and modernization, and that their blood would be useful to basically white Euro-American scientists. And that research really opened up a whole world for me about not just about race, but race and its imbrication with technologies that sort of face that the role of race, that seem to be neutral, that seem to be apolitical. And I've been really interested in how biology and technology kind of co-produce each other or co-constitute each other. And as Jeremy said, I kind of think about myself as a historian of biomedical futures, the way that we kind of get the science and the technology that people imagine we should have. And so I've been really influenced by people like Ruha Benjamin, who talk about, what kinds of stories we tell and what kinds of fictions and fantasies. So I've been thinking a lot about fiction and science fiction these days. Yeah, I mean, can I ask Professor Hatch a question?
Yeah, let's jump into it, and then Jeremy can come back in for sure.
So I was really, one of the things I love about your work is how you situate yourself. You bring your own stories and your own narratives and your own kind of just the way we've been telling, how did we get into this? This is in your books, it's in your writing. And I think it makes it so powerful because it helps people to understand why these issues are important and why you should be trusted. And I think, trust is a huge issue that we're dealing with as a nation around, vaccination, around all of these kinds of issues. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you've navigated those questions of trust when you're writing about these issues of race and its medicalization, and what your vantage point is on it.
This is a great question. It makes me think of Frederick Douglass, who, as far as I can tell, was the first so-called Negro to use the phrase, I speak here. He was speaking for an anti-abolitionist society in, I think, 1859, and said, I speak here, as a Negro, and I scan the country from that kind of moral and political horizon. And he just kind of claimed his positionality, as he offered this kind of stinging critique, which we're kind of so familiar with. My training in sociology was, had many influences. I mentioned the stats and demography, but at the University of Maryland, we had a pretty live concentration in social theory and all sorts of social theory of all kinds. And I ended up studying for my dissertation with the Black feminist theorist Patricia Hill Collins. And I didn't know it, but I was her first ever doctoral student. And that I would probably safely attribute my positioning myself as a subject in my own truth-telling, in my own storytelling, to the Black feminist tradition and to the critical race tradition, which did not necessarily ask me to negate or set aside my subjectivity, to set aside my standpoint. In fact, to the contrary, I can only offer, in some sense, a truth, given my standpoint and my positionality. And so I tried to find engaging ways to tell sociological stories that in which I was a subject. I was the person doing the looking. I tried to make my methodology, and I think that Joanna, that you mentioned this question of methodology. I want to come back to this because I tried to make my methodologies as transparent as possible. And I know that's partly me following a process and trying to kind of explain to my reader, at least in the books, kind of what I did. And so it's a way to demonstrate rigor outside of necessarily like an empirical logic. And that was the conversations that Dr. Collins and I had. We talked about this quite a bit, actually. She was not as versed in the science and technology studies literature as I would later become. And so she was approaching, that mentoring me early on from a more sociology of knowledge standpoint, where, you wouldn't think of annexing yourself from the world. And that's maybe fundamental to sociological worldview. So I don't know if that means that a reader necessarily trusts me more. I certainly think about this as a strategy for substantiating claims, right? So I certainly, for example, in Blood Sugar, I write about my experience as a type 1 diabetic of many, many, many years. And that experience does give me some authority. Joan Scott's Experience as Evidence essay, in which I read in feminist theory back in the day, still rings true for me on this point, that I don't have to annex that that experience. And in fact, it can help me substantiate or ground claims in a sociological argument.
Yeah, I wonder, that makes a lot of sense to me. I wonder, for people in the discussion that maybe aren't as well-versed in sociology, if maybe you might want to talk a little bit about, like Troy Duster's idea of, the sort of the sort of medicalization of race and what has happened. I mean, there's a deep history, you know, that we could go way back, but I think both of us have expertise that's focused more in the 20th century, in the post-war period, when people wanted to imagine that race was done. And you start to see after the Second World War and the atrocities of, you know, the Nazis, this sort of shift to saying, oh, we're a post-racial and we're not even going to talk about races anymore. We're going to talk about populations. And yet somehow race comes in the back door. And, you know, I think your work really carries forth that kind of tradition that Troy Duster talks about in what he calls like a backdoor to eugenics. But I wondered, especially in blood sugar, where, you know, you really start to talk about statistical knowledge making, which we might want to think of as being deracinated and, you know, objective and true. How do you see, or how have you seen race reappear there?
You're so right to point to Troy Duster's work, and for everybody, you know, in this space, if you know, this would be someone whose work to pick up, especially Backdoor to Eugenics, this classic book that you know, I actually relied on quite a bit in writing Silent Cells. You know, thinking about, you know, kind of a critical race sociology of knowledge framework, like what does that look like, and reading his work specifically for his method, and trying to read that carefully. You know, you know, my entry point into the understanding of race and into the study of race and racism, again, didn't come from science studies. And my entry point was first, you know, kind of Black reading in Black political economy, thinking about the kind of classic sociologists, people like Oliver Cromwell Cox and W.E.B. Du Bois and Anna Julia Cooper, writing in the early, you know, 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, about racial conditions in the United States, reading really everybody from, actually, I'm just thinking back to my 11th grade, and I was in 11th grade in Atlanta, Georgia. We formed a Black Studies reading group, and we were reading, you know, all these authors. David Walker back in those days. So always thinking about the kind of political context for race in the United States, and I always, from those days in early 1990s, understood race to be something that was political. I didn't quite understand in the ways in which it was biological. I mean, you have to understand. I mean, I grew up in Stone Mountain, Georgia, Lithonia in Stone Mountain, Georgia, about 20 miles outside of Atlanta. Stone Mountain, for the people may know, is the largest piece of exposed granite in this hemisphere, but it also features prominently an etching of 3 Confederate war generals riding off to, you know, protect the South. And so this is where I grew up. So my experience of race and my understanding of racism was grounded in the political, and that grooved with the understanding from people like Duster and other critical race thinkers that racism was like a policy first, and then an ideology or a science second. Like the program of racism was about theft and appropriation and about labor and land. And then all of the other kind of, I don't want to call it artifice, but like kind of the ideas about race were born after the theft had taken place, right? They're an alibi. The race was in some sense scientized in order to justify those dominations, to justify the theft, to make the theft appear as if it were in fact an act of nature, to make the theft to appear as if it were an act of history, right? So with developmentalism, right, this idea that, well, you know, the African, they'll eventually get to where we are. They're not there yet, right? That kind of idea. So, you know, all of those different kind of racial theories were just deployed and were scientized with all sorts of evidence and data, from brain size and skull to, you know, the sphygmomanometer number. I mean, you can look at Lundy Braun's work. There's so many people who've looked at every part of the body to show how, you know, scientists were really just kind of covering up structural racism with these scientific ideas. And so, to me, you know, when I'm thinking about the medicalization of race, I'm thinking about that history of scientific racism. At the same time, there's also been a really interesting development more recently, and maybe we can talk about this on the kind of social epidemiology side, the public health side, which is more like a medicalization of racism, like
Mm.
where we're trying to track and trace all of the embodiments that racism creates, right? We're measuring that in all kinds of ways. The work I did on metabolic syndrome in the book Blood Sugar, I mean, for the people who don't know, metabolic syndrome is a biomedical category that encompasses the major risk factors for heart disease and stroke. These kind of biomarkers, right? Your weight, um, your cholesterol level, your blood sugar. So these biomarkers are really the effects of racism, right? But when measured in the body, they're read as race. And so we've seen this kind of medicalization of racism on the one hand, wanting to track and trace those effects, but then we read them in the body and they're very easily conscripted into what Duster called this backdoor to racism, right?
Right. Yeah. So that makes me, I guess wanting to ask a question, another question. So, I teach in a number of different places around Yale's campus, but I also teach in the medical school and, and teach medical students. And something that I think is a real struggle is the slipperiness of the idea of the social construction of race. And there's a real challenge in that you're dealing with many very eminent physicians and research scientists that were kind of came of age in a time when things were supposed to be post-racial, and who don't who see race as only something that's just a sort of descriptor. It's not about people, yet we hear that there is a hidden curriculum and the ways in which physicians, wind up using race as a proxy, or racist assumptions as proxies for how they do things. And one of the challenges that my colleagues and I face, and a few of them are here today, John Warner, and I see Nathan Ha, I'm not sure who else, as historians working with medical students, is, how to say, well, race is just socially constructed, only gets you halfway there, because there are still, these ways that race, as you pointed out, has been rationalized or serves as a proxy for talking about other kinds of things, or the effects of racism on bodies have had demonstrable biological effects that are not necessarily inherent to someone's constitution, but represent generations of of violence that have been inherited. So I wonder if you might be able to help us think about this thorny sort of question of race as a kind of biosocial category. What does it mean to say race isn't real? What does it mean to, what's at stake there?
Right. This is also, I should say, in the Science and Society program at Wesleyan, where I teach and have taught for, this is my 6th year, we are an inherently interdisciplinary program. We have about 90 undergraduate Wesleyan majors, and half of our majors are double majoring in a science, right? Biology, molecular biology, chemistry, earth and environmental sciences, neuroscience, psychology, and the like. And then they often concentrate in social sciences, and then have courses in science studies, philosophy, history, sociocultural studies of science. And so we are constantly playing in this terrain that you described, where I've got basically proto scientists in my class who have a certain way of understanding the way the body works. And then they're also trying to understand how society and culture work, right, with new exposure. I guess the thing that usually works for me is we have to have a lesson about signification in science, right? And how signs like the word race, the language like the word race, has multiple valences, and it's hard to locate it, right? So, if you want to locate race in the body, you'll be looking for a long time because it ain't there. What you're seeing when you look in a body are the effects of racial stratification. When you see a racially differentiated body, a body that appears to be biologically differentiated along a racial line, you're looking at the effects of like the fallout of racism, to draw on Joseph Mascow's term, or the afterlife of slavery, if you want to borrow from the Afro-pessimists, right? You're seeing the effects of social structure in the body. And so what scientists have been doing for a long time, including a lot of medical researchers, they look in the body, they do a lab test, they get that result, they link that result to the race, to the sign of race on the form, and they think, oh, this data is now thus racialized. And it's in that body, and its meaning can only be discerned relative to this subject. When we know from the history of race that the meaning of race is always tied to the race as a social entity. In other words, race doesn't live in that body, it exists in the social, right? And racism produces effects that are biological, and that's the trick, right? Race isn't real as such, but racism produces biological effects that then scientists have to interpret very carefully so as not to mistakenly argue that those differences that they found are the result of something called race that lives in that body. That's a mistake. And so that was the trap that Troy Duster was trying to get people not to fall into, that when you're looking at the effects of racism in a body, you have to properly attribute what caused those effects. And the cause is not race as such. The cause is these forces that produce patterns of living that result in changed bodies. And so, walking a physician through this, usually a few times, is pretty helpful. They're pretty smart, right? But you're also working against, as you point out, right? By that point, by the time you get to medical school, years of kind of racial conditioning. I mean, whether you're a scientist or not, you're still part of the American racial cultural schema. So, you're not all of a sudden outside of that because you're just positioned in science. Race travels through there as well. And so, it's really tricky, right? This basically means, in my opinion, that, physician researchers, they got to have some social theory under their belt. You got to know some history, because you'll actually inadvertently be doing violence to the very persons you claim to be helping, by obscuring the social, by obscuring the role of social forces in shaping their health outcomes, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's really great, and it is. I mean, race and racism are very slippery, and I think again of Ruha Benjamin, a brilliant social theorist and science studies scholar at Princeton, who writes about how racism is like a technology. It's innovative. Just when I think about the whack-a-mole arcade game, just when you think you've sort of contained it, it like pops up someplace else. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is how what's happening with COVID may be laying the groundwork for another reinscription of race. So just let me sort of play out the scenario. Right now, as testing has been scaling up, we have, many people, more people than ever, coming under a certain amount of epidemiological giving samples. And we also know that COVID is disproportionately impacting, people of color. And there's a temptation there, right, to say what you're saying, this is race. There's something in them that's race, that's making them more susceptible. And one of the things that I think we might be attentive to is to be concerned that these samples that are being collected and possibly preserved are not then being fed into these genomic systems of racial analysis that are kind of looking to say, oh, here, this is the portion of the DNA sequence that makes you susceptible to COVID, and it's a Black or it's a Latino or whatever sort of sequence. And I guess I'm curious, Professor Hatch, how, the work that you've done on inferential statistical analysis, and in your work on diabetes and metabolic syndrome might help offer some cautionary language about how we can both attend to the kind of disproportionate impacts of COVID without, re-inscribing race as, or leading people to be cast as biologically inferior or something like that. Like, what are the ways that we might be able to help circumvent that process?
I want to say that at some point in recent weeks, months, I saw an advertisement or a fragment in social media linking the All of Us program to COVID. That
it's happening.
Right, that there's this kind of data integration happening at a systems level. That, I mean, there's another piece. I mean, to throw your in addition to your supposition, that, I mean, there was so instantly a discourse of susceptibility and vulnerability as soon as the first public health reports came out, that they were out of like a jurisdiction in Kentucky. It was just a small, finding that African Americans were disproportionately dying from COVID compared to others. That instantly the discourse of susceptibility and race begins to carry the story, right? That race becomes the vehicle through which susceptibility is conveyed, right? Through, say, your family line, which it couldn't. I mean, there's no evidence of that I've seen yet. It actually has more to do with occupation and gender, as Sarah Richardson and her folks have been pointing out at Harvard for months now. So I worry about the data integration for another reason, though, and that is that, as soon as the Trump administration learned who was dying, it seemed as if that was the very moment they decided to kind of pull back. This is in early April. What Mark Meadows, who was at that time, this is the chief of staff, said they needed like a state, stand down, a state, a handoff.
Yeah.
And so, actually in this case, a perversity has occurred. And it's not unusual or unexpected in a monstrous state like this one, where the evidence of racial inequality actually was used to further target, this is just another form of instrumentalized and murder, right? To withdraw life support, essentially, knowing what effect it would have. And so that data is being weaponized and manipulated in ways that I'm not sure I quite anticipated. I never quite saw that as a possibility. But I worry about the integration of all of the COVID-related data and all of these health-related federal data projects with other criminal justice-related data projects that we know are ongoing throughout the federal data apparatus. For me, what's really a trip is that, and I think this more came up for me in the Silent Cells project, is that the state, the nation state, this American settler state, is on the one hand an amazing collector of data. Oh my goodness. And yet also not, right? They don't know how many migrant children they took, but they can pretty well estimate where their parents are. They can pretty well estimate how much space debris there is. Right. So, we can estimate. So, I mean, there's just these paradoxes around data and knowledge and the state that circulate around race and inequality for sure, but that I think are more endemic to something about the way this particular state is dealing with data and bodies. That's worrisome to me.
Yeah, I wondered if we could talk a little bit about the Silent Cells work, because I just think it's so brilliant. And it, maybe I might invite you just to say a little bit about the book for those that haven't had a chance, because it's still pretty new, 2019,
Yeah.
a little bit about the book. And then I just have some, some questions for you, because I think that the insights that you draw are ramify, so far out for how we think about our engagement with these kinds of drugs.
Yeah. So, yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this actually. So Silent Cells, The Secret Drugging of Captive America is a book that tries to understand the role that psychotropic drugs play in mass captivity in the United States. To
And could you just
include,
define what you mean by psychotropic?
yes, of course. So, there's really two key terms in this sentence. One is psychotropic, which in this meaning corresponds to prescription medications that change brain chemistry and affect the central nervous system, right? And this is an umbrella term that encompasses several subclasses of drugs. No doubt in the book, I take each one, as it comes up in any particular case. But these are all drugs that are intended to help people manage everything from everyday emotional disorders and problems to serious psychiatric disorders. And setting aside the question of what those diagnostic categories might mean. So I was interested in the role that these medicines might be playing in mass incarceration. I wanted to know how prisons used pharmaceuticals. I just kind of wanted to know, what was going on, and I wasn't finding much. And so this is in 2009, right when I graduated from graduate school. And so I began just kind of digging and looking. And I was just kind of shocked. I'll tell one quick story from the book that introduces the book and really got the project going. I was in this in a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship at the Morehouse School of Medicine. It was like, me and 5 other, it was all Black people, all working on issues of HIV, AIDS, substance use and mental health in prisons and jails. And one day, a former prison psychiatrist from the Georgia Department of Corrections came to visit us and talk to us about her work. And I was kind of thinking about a way of, following pharmaceuticals out of my dissertation and keeping going on that project. And so I asked this psychiatrist what she thought about the use of, what she thought about the use of psych meds in prisons. And she kind of rocked back on her heels and kind of smirked and said, well, let me put it to you this way. Each year, the warden sends me and my staff a nice bottle of something because he knows we keep the prisons quiet. And I just wanted to know, was she right? And so I set out on this, ended up, 8-year investigation, trying to find out everything I could possibly find out about the history and the use of psychotropic drugs in prisons and their use in other institutional contexts where the state has the power to hold people against their will. And so this includes everything from the active duty military to the foster system, to nursing homes, to sex offenders, to unlawful combatants, to immigrant children. All of these are all populations, as I document in the book, who are subjected to practices of drugging. And those practices of drugging do not necessarily seem to be intended to treat someone's mental health. They're designed to pacify an institutional crisis. They're designed to keep a lid on mass incarceration. They're designed to keep unruly persons and dangerous persons subordinated. And so I just tried to, gather up as much evidence as I possibly could around those questions in that book.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that sort of jumped out to me, in reading it, it made me think back to Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which we often think about as a story of eugenics, which is certainly relevant to our conversation. But it's also a story, if you remember, the drug Soma. Why don't people revolt against this stratified system of selective breeding? Because they're all taking this drug. And this is something that I, think about a lot. What does it mean that these psychopharmaceuticals are so readily and widely available, even to those of us who don't, who are not, incarcerated? What are the ways in which the kind of ubiquity of these drugs, enables a kind of biomedical fix to what are actual social problems? And that's something that I find really striking, in that locating, using your work to think about this as grounded in a certain kind of desire to contain and incarcerate, and a perpetuation of what Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow, right? That, the prison industrial complex is just a continuation of slavery, and how much that's kind of been extended out, to people of a variety of, backgrounds and profiles. And I wonder, if you think that's a legitimate kind of mode of thinking. And I would just add one other little historical vignette that kind of came to mind when I was first reading the book, was that when you're talking about drugs that people in this conversation may be taking or may be on, like
Yes.
things like Xanax or or Ativan, right? Or certain kinds of SSRIs, but I was thinking also about when Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert at Harvard were able to get a hold of psilocybin. The very first place they took it was the prison,
Yes.
and that should tell you something about well, what does it tell us?
Well, in one of the chapters in the book, and I'm so glad you brought up the story of the mushrooms, right? Because I think that these psychotropics, as conceived as laboratory productions versus as naturally occurring in nature, they have a shared history as weapons of state terrorism and scientific investigation. And one of the reasons why I suspect they took it to the prison was because of the controlled nature of the experiments they might run. So one of the things that I uncovered in Silent Cells, and this is a history I didn't know, was that the American pharmaceutical industry kind of really got its start in prisons, right? They were doing experiments on prisoners back in the 20s and 30s, and all the way through the 1960s, and through the 1970s, up until 1980. And so, I was curious about where the knowledge was produced that these compounds had effects that could be characterized in particular ways, and it could be useful to not just the prison or the asylum, but to other kinds of institutions like the military, for example, right? There were all kinds of weaponized applications. So I talk about in Silent Cells the use of these medications among enemy combatants as so-called truth serum. I mean, those are very much analogous to those kinds of experiments with LSD and psilocybin, right? Trying to get people to, get the communists to confess or something, the location of their base in that Cold War scientific mode. But in the chapter in the book, Experimental Patriots, I really show how, this was, the experimentation was extensive. And I think I just scratched the surface of how extensive it was. For people who are listening, every source in the book is publicly available. Every single source I cite in this book was publicly available. It was very important that every single source be available to a public, and nothing be even behind a FOIA request or, trying to bring those things to the light of day. But it was actually the sociologist Jackie Orr who got me thinking that
Panic Diaries.
Panic Diaries, that maybe what was going on was a scale of pacification that I had not considered. And maybe pacification isn't quite the right word for all of what's happening. In the book, I used I borrowed the term from Patricia Williams, spirit murder, to describe the kinds of the most grotesque versions of forced drugging that I uncovered in the book, that are really designed to make us forget about those persons whose lives depend on our regard. And that's what Patricia Williams was really arguing about, right? That we have in these medicines technologies that allow us to forget those who cry at night, right? And we can just silence them, and we can silence ourselves so that we don't even hear the cries anymore. And so maybe we do that with psychotropics, maybe we do that with heroin, maybe we do that with opiates. Right now the United States is kind of, it's in an affective disaster, an emotional disaster. So these are all very useful technologies in this context.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and we've seen with, we have this opioid epidemic and the Sackler family, right, that, encourage the overselling of the benefits of, oxycodone and other drugs are now kind of being held to task, but the cat is out of the bag. It's, it's much bigger, but, I wonder, it made me want to ask you a question about, something you say in terms of, again, your method, that I think is implicit in some of the things you've been talking about. You said, okay, all these people are doing these good projects that, they're being federally, like I could be a part of this, getting federal funding to do work on, incarcerated people, and that's a kind of like good liberal science, but I don't want to do that. I want to do liberatory science. And I wonder if you could say something, because what I really admire about your work is that it's not just diagnostic. It's not just saying, here's something bad that happened. It's you're actually trying to give your readers tools and resources to do something different. And I wondered, I guess we're kind of rounding out the hour, but I think it would be really inspiring for you to talk a little bit about, the kind of liberatory social science that you're doing.
Sure. And I mean, I was inspired by so many other people before me, and I just couldn't do another study, right? That was gonna, garner for me professional accolade, or, I just didn't. That's not why I got into this. And when I graduated from the University of Maryland and went to join these people at Morehouse, I was fired up, right? I wanted to do work that I thought was meaningful. I wanted to do scholarship that, like, I didn't necessarily see myself as somebody who was going to be in a front line doing battle, but I wanted to be one of the people producing the ideas that were useful in battle, right? And so, to me, if I'm only asking questions that an institution of power has deemed worthy of being asked, then I'm somehow on the wrong track, maybe, right? I mean, there are many scholars, myself included, who have been funded for various projects, and not to say that having big funding is necessarily going to mean you're going to do some kind of Uncle Tom science, but I would just encourage students, undergraduate and graduate, and even my colleagues, right, to continually, we see what's at stake. So we have to, from wherever we are positioned, be truth tellers, right? As Ruha tells us to imagine these new worlds. I think this is right. And so, and I have to say though, having said all that, I did publish a book, right? I earn enough royalties on this book each year to buy myself one tire for one of my cars. So this is not, this is not a money-making endeavor. It's really about trying to produce the most rigorous ideas, rigorous scholarship I can, and ask questions that are, come from the bottom. Right. And so, and I think I'm still thinking about what my next project is going to be, but it's going to be something along these lines.
Yeah, thank you. I think there might be a question or two from the audience.
Yeah, so I think a little while ago, I got a question in the chat about BIDIL for both of you, just because Professor Radin, you deal with biomedical futures, and Professor Hatch, you mentioned this in blood sugar. So I think it'd be really interesting thinking about what the legacy of BIDIL means when we're trying to go to a context of personalized medicine, and how race has often, at least to this point, been a really intermediate, at least, phase in this, where the transition from general to personalized has always gone through race, and kind of, if you could talk about the legacy of BIDIL and just that transition.
I could maybe say something about the history of BIDIL, and then maybe Professor Hatch, you want us to talk about that legacy, in just that, BIDIL is a blood pressure drug that was designed or tested in such a way that it could get FDA approval to be specifically marketed towards African American people. The drug even upon its approval, was very controversial because it turns out that it's actually effective for everybody. It's not, it doesn't, there's no real race-based dimension to the drug. But what Bidil, the company, did that was very interesting is that they took some of the methods of grassroots activism and recruited Black activists to speak on behalf of the drug. And I was actually at a workshop at MIT on race and medicine back in—
I was there also.
Were you there?
Oh my
Do you remember
gosh.
that?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. So one of
Wow.
a community representative for Bidil got up and started yelling at the panelists, calling them racist for criticizing the way that Bidil had tried to corner the market. And this was a room full of scholars who were really trying to upend and get underneath these questions of the medicalization of race. And so it was a very complicated situation because there was an outcry, or what appeared to be an outcry, coming from Black activists that people, academics were trying to block their access to a drug that had been FDA approved. But there was again this kind of categorical shell game happening that made it seem like this drug could do things that it wasn't necessarily doing, that in the process it re-medicalized race. I don't know if I've accurately portrayed that, or you have a different memory, but it was really shocking.
You're absolutely right. And, other people have documented the scrupulous efforts of pharmaceutical companies, but it seemed to be in this case that this was a coordinated effort, right? That these community leaders were enlisted as thought leaders who could not, they were Black too. You can't easily just shout down a Black man in the public at MIT. You're not going to yell him down. And so that was a very forceful and I think devious marketing strategy, one that ultimately didn't work. I mean, so it's a part of the legacy of Bidil and the company Nitromed that made it is the Nitromed went out of business. Bidil didn't work. I mean, I think what's interesting from a marketing point of view is that, if you ask any Black person, hey, would you take a medicine that is only for Black people? They would say, to hell no, I'm not taking any medicines just for us. What's that sound like? And so it was a misread. But I think Bidil was a trial balloon because there are many other kinds of efforts underway to sneak race into all kinds of biomedical products and devices. It gets written into as Ruha and many others have written into the code of software devices. It's in the design and function. It's in the user packets and the marketing materials. It's in the cultural representations as well. I mean, we were just reading in my cultural studies of health class, Joanna Kepner's work on migraines. And the pharmaceutical industry did a masterful job creating a cultural world around certain migraine medicines for people to consume. And so, the legacy for Bidil is be on the lookout for more, I think. And finally, the other lesson I would say, the other important lesson is that Bidil wasn't going to solve the heart disease epidemic among African Americans. And so, we know what's going to fundamentally do that, and that's a fundamental transformation in the fundamental causes of disease, right? The social determinants of health. You got to change those. Unless you change those, you're just playing around the edges.
Yeah, and connected to that, something that's emerging that I think is really relevant to COVID and a COVID vaccine. We have a narrative about, who anti-vaxxers are. That there's a certain kind of like white overprotective, mother. But if you look at the history, as you've pointed out and your own research has looked at of sort of the experimentation that's happened on Black and brown bodies, people in the African American community, including in New Haven, have been very outspoken saying, you know what, I don't think I would take a COVID vaccine. I have a lot of mistrust, and I think that mistrust is legitimate. But we don't have a good way of talking about, the barriers to vaccine acceptance. And so I wonder, what your thoughts are there, because this is just an issue that is even more intense now, hearing about the Pfizer vaccine that's got this supposed 90% effectiveness, but the data hasn't been published yet. What is your work? How does your work help us think about how to interpret this news as it's coming?
Well, this is maybe in some sense a conclusion to one of the first things that we mentioned, and this is around trust in science. And, for his part, President Trump, and for their part, Republicans, and their kind of cultural apparatus have really successfully destabilized our trust in, many Americans' trust in science. If it was already, something to be dismantled. And so my hope, this is maybe the hopeful, and hopeful wish, maybe prayer, is that, President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris's election will signal I want to say a return to trusting the state a little bit more, and trusting state science, which is a paradox.
Complicated thing
it's
to
complicated.
say.
So,
if
and
we
again,
say trust science, even as we've been talking about the ways that science is complicit, we need a different way of thinking about what that means.
It's very complicated, and I think that time isn't on our side, so we don't have a lot of time to adjudicate this and talk about this. But I think that these conversations are happening in lots of places. But I don't know if everybody who needs to have the Zoom link has the Zoom link to these conversations around race and the vaccine and how we're going to survive the pandemic. For sure.
Yeah, and one on another kind of hopeful note, the fact that one of the co-chairs for the COVID commission is Dr. Marcella Nunez-Smith at Yale, who's done amazing work on racism and medicine. That does signal at least that people at the top are aware that this is a necessary dimension of how science might need to function in order to regain some credibility and trust.
I certainly hope so. Well, maybe we'll turn it back to Jeremy. Hi, Jeremy.
Hi, how are you guys?
I'm rolling now. I'm good now. Let's go.
Another hour? Yeah, I think so. We're a little bit over time, but if anybody has follow-up questions, you can definitely email them to me. It's jeremy.ottridge@yale.edu, and I can relay them to Professor Hatch and Professor Radin, and maybe we can come up with a follow-up message to everyone next week or something around then. As I said earlier, hopefully today or tomorrow, I'll send everybody an email that contains all of their works. So if you're interested in reading more about anything that we mentioned today, that will be a resource that you guys can work on. And then, as I said earlier, I'll also send our website so you can look at some of the other conversations we've had. And if you think there's anybody that couldn't come that should see all of this, snippets of this or anything, it'll be on our website and on YouTube so you can share with everyone. A big thank you to Professor Radin, Professor Hatch for joining us today. We really appreciate the time, the thought, the effort, the openness. We really appreciate you taking the time. And thank you everybody for coming. We really appreciate your time, and have a wonderful week.
Thanks, and thank you to you, Jeremy, for organizing and doing such great work with your peers.
Yes, thank you to everybody, for sure. Thank you so much for your time and attention this evening. Please stay safe.